The man's voice broke before he finished his first sentence. He stood at the podium, hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned pale, eyes fixed on the floor, as if looking up might undo him completely. This wasn't the posture of someone arguing a case. It was the posture of someone barely holding himself together. Judge Frank Caprio noticed it instantly. Before the charge was even read, before the fine was mentioned, the judge leaned forward slightly, studying the man's face instead of the paperwork. Years on the bench had taught him that real stories didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrived trembling. The ticket itself was small, just $50, something most people would pay without a second thought. But the way this man stood there made it feel heavier than any serious crime. His shoulders sagged with a quiet exhaustion that couldn't be faked. His breathing was uneven, like he had already lost a battle long before walking into the courtroom. Judge Caprio asked him a simple question. "Are you all right, sir?" That was all it took. The man swallowed hard, nodded once, then shook his head as if neither answer felt honest enough. His lips parted, but no words came out. The courtroom, usually restless and impatient, went still. Even the clerk paused, pen hovering above the page. This wasn't about a parking violation anymore. Something else was happening here. Something heavier. Something human. Judge Caprio waited. He didn't rush him. He didn't fill the silence. He just watched, allowing the moment to unfold on its own. The judge had seen anger, arrogance, excuses, and defiance countless times. What stood in front of him now was none of those things. It was a man who looked like he had carried responsibility for too long without relief. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. And in that fragile sound was the hint of a story that no fine, no citation, and no legal code could properly measure. What followed would turn a routine case into a moment no one in that courtroom would forget. The man's name was Daniel Harper, a quiet, soft-spoken father in his late 40s whose appearance told a story long before he ever spoke. His hair was thinning at the temples, his face worn not by age alone, but by years of responsibility that never seemed to ease. The sleeves of his jacket were slightly frayed, not enough to draw attention, but enough to suggest that replacing it had never been a priority. He stood alone at the podium. No lawyer, no family seated behind him, just a folded piece of paper in his hand and a weight in his chest that made every breath feel deliberate. Judge Caprio glanced down at the file and then back up at Daniel. A parking violation. $50. Parked beyond the posted time limit near a hospital zone. Nothing unusual on paper. Yet something about Daniel's posture didn't match the simplicity of the charge. He stood like a man waiting for news he already feared. Daniel explained that morning in a low, careful voice. He had parked where he shouldn't have. He didn't deny it. He didn't argue the sign or the timing. He admitted fault immediately, as if he had practiced saying it on the drive over. What he didn't explain right away was why he had been there. Judge Caprio asked him where he was headed when the ticket was issued. Daniel hesitated, eyes lifting briefly toward the judge before dropping again. He said he had been at the hospital. His teenage son had been admitted overnight after a severe asthma attack. Daniel had stayed until dawn, sleeping upright in a chair beside the bed. When he finally stepped out to grab a coffee and some fresh air, the ticket was already on his windshield. He paused there, as if unsure whether to continue. Judge Caprio waited, hands resting calmly on the bench, giving him space instead of pressure. Daniel went on. He worked full-time as a delivery driver. Missed hours meant missed pay. Missed payment choices no parent wanted to make. Rent, groceries, medication. His wife had passed away years earlier, and since then, every responsibility had landed squarely on his shoulders. There was no backup plan, no second income, just him. The $50 fine wasn't devastating on its own. Daniel made that clear, but it was what it represented. Another unexpected cost on top of a life already stretched thin. Another reminder that no matter how careful he tried to be, something always seemed to tip the balance. As he spoke, Judge Caprio noticed the way Daniel's voice steadied when he talked about his son. Despite everything, there was pride there. Protection. Love. The kind that keeps a parent standing even when they're exhausted beyond measure. The courtroom listened quietly. This wasn't a dramatic confession. There were no raised voices or emotional pleas. Just a man explaining his reality with honesty, hoping that being truthful would be enough. Judge Caprio looked back down at the file, then up at Daniel once more. He had heard thousands of explanations over the years. Few carried this much quiet weight, and something told him this case was far from over. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly, studying Daniel in silence. The courtroom remained still, the kind of stillness that follows honesty when no one wants to interrupt it. Then the judge asked a simple question that shifted the weight of the room. How long had Daniel been raising his son alone? Daniel answered without hesitation. Almost 12 years. His wife had passed unexpectedly, leaving behind a toddler who barely understood what had happened. From that moment on, Daniel had learned how to become two parents at once. He learned how to cook dinners after long shifts, how to help with homework late at night, how to sit through hospital visits alone without letting fear show on his face. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, listening not just to the words but to what sat beneath them. He asked about Daniel's work schedule. Daniel explained that he worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when overtime was available. Early mornings, long routes, heavy loads. He rarely complained. He needed the hours. Medical bills didn't wait. Neither did rent. The judge glanced again at the citation. Hospital zone violations carried stricter enforcement for a reason. Rules existed to protect access and safety. Judge Caprio acknowledged that. But his eyes returned to Daniel, and his tone softened as he asked whether Daniel had tried to contest the ticket earlier. Daniel shook his head. He said he didn't think his situation mattered. He believed the law was the law. He had broken it, even if the reason felt unavoidable. So he paid attention to the date, took time off work, and showed up. That answer lingered. Judge Caprio explained calmly that many people came into his courtroom ready to argue, deflect, or minimize responsibility. Daniel had done none of that. He had taken responsibility before being asked. But responsibility, the judge noted, did not erase circumstance. The conversation turned toward Daniel's son again. Judge Caprio asked how he was doing now. Daniel said he was stable, back in school, trying to act tougher than he felt. He smiled briefly at that, then caught himself and looked down again. The judge asked if Daniel had ever served in the military. Daniel's expression changed instantly. His shoulders straightened slightly, almost by instinct. He said yes. He had enlisted right after high school, served overseas, did his duty, came home, built a family, tried to live quietly afterward. That answer drew a subtle shift in the courtroom. Judge Caprio acknowledged the service but didn't dwell on it yet. Instead, he asked how Daniel had adjusted after returning to civilian life. Daniel hesitated again. He said the transition hadn't been easy. Some nights were harder than others. He didn't elaborate, and the judge didn't push. The restraint spoke louder than details ever could. The tension grew not from conflict between people, but from the collision of principles. The law was clear. The violation was real. The fine was modest but enforceable. Yet the human cost of enforcing it felt heavier by the minute. Judge Caprio explained that his role wasn't just to apply rules mechanically. It was to understand people. But understanding didn't always lead to leniency. That uncertainty hung in the air. Daniel stood quietly, hands clasped, eyes forward. He didn't plead. He didn't ask for mercy. He simply waited. The courtroom felt the imbalance. A man who had given years of service. A father carrying more than his share. And a system designed to treat every case the same, even when no two lives ever are. Judge Caprio looked down once more, then removed his glasses and set them gently on the bench. The movement was small but deliberate. Anyone familiar with his courtroom knew that gesture meant something important was coming. The decision wasn't ready yet. But whatever happened next would go far beyond a $50 ticket. Judge Caprio remained quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the file in front of him. The courtroom waited. Daniel stood still, his posture steady but tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of carrying responsibility without relief. He had said everything he needed to say. Now it was out of his hands. The judge finally looked up. He asked Daniel to step a little closer. Daniel did, careful and respectful, unsure of what was coming next. Judge Caprio spoke calmly, asking Daniel to confirm his years of service. Daniel answered plainly. He had enlisted young, served overseas, and returned home hoping to build a normal life. The judge asked where he had been stationed. Daniel named the place without drama, as if it were just another fact, though a flicker crossed his face that suggested memories he rarely visited. Judge Caprio nodded. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush. He allowed the silence to do its work. Then he asked Daniel how old he was. Daniel answered honestly. He was in his late 40s, old enough to have lived several lives already, young enough to still be expected to keep going without complaint. The judge leaned forward slightly. He spoke about responsibility, about how some people carry it for a season, while others carry it for a lifetime. He said that serving your country doesn't always end when a uniform comes off. For many, it simply changes shape. The room felt heavier with each word. Judge Caprio said he had seen many cases like this on paper. A minor violation, a small fine, easy to process, easy to dismiss. But he explained that sometimes the smallest cases revealed the biggest truths about a person. He looked directly at Daniel. He spoke about fathers who show up even when they are exhausted, about men who keep promises even when no one is watching, about people who don't make excuses even when they have every reason to. Daniel swallowed hard. His eyes dropped for a moment, then lifted again, glistening but controlled. He did not cry. He had learned long ago how to hold himself together. Judge Caprio paused. Then he did something no one in the courtroom expected. He stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, and respectful. Chairs creaked softly as a few people in the gallery shifted, unsure of what they were witnessing. Daniel froze, instinctively straightening his back. Judge Caprio stepped out from behind the bench, just enough to be seen clearly. He looked at Daniel and said that before he ruled on the ticket, there was something more important he needed to acknowledge. He spoke about service, about sacrifice that doesn't come with headlines or medals, about the quiet courage it takes to keep going long after the applause ends. Then Judge Frank Caprio raised his hand and delivered a crisp, unmistakable salute. The courtroom fell completely silent. Daniel didn't move at first. The gesture caught him off guard in a way nothing else had. His breath caught. His training kicked in a second later. He returned the salute automatically, his hand steady despite the emotion breaking through his composure. For a brief moment, they stood there facing each other, not as judge and defendant, not as authority and subject, but as two men recognizing something deeper than a traffic violation. The salute ended, but the impact didn't. Judge Caprio returned to the bench, his voice calm but filled with meaning. He said the law mattered, but so did dignity. So did context. So did humanity. Daniel lowered his hand. His face tightened with emotion he no longer tried to hide. The weight he had carried for years finally shifted, just enough to let him breathe. The $50 ticket no longer felt like the point. What had just happened would stay with everyone in that room far longer than any fine ever could. Judge Caprio picked up the file again, but the tone of the room had already changed. What remained now was not tension, but clarity. He spoke carefully, making sure his words landed where they needed to. He said the law existed for a reason. Rules mattered. Accountability mattered. But justice, he explained, was never meant to be blind to the human being standing in front of the court. It was meant to balance responsibility with understanding. He looked at Daniel and asked one final question. Not about the ticket, not about the date or the location. He asked how Daniel's children were doing. The question caught Daniel off guard more than the salute had. He answered honestly. They were trying. School was expensive. Life was heavy. Some days were harder than others. But he showed up. Every morning. Every night. Judge Caprio nodded slowly. He said that showing up consistently was one of the hardest forms of service there was. Harder than one moment of courage. Harder than one decision. It required endurance. He explained his ruling clearly and calmly. The ticket would be dismissed. Not ignored. Not excused. But dismissed in recognition of Daniel's service, his character, and the effort he continued to give despite carrying more than most people ever saw. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. Not applause. Not celebration, just a collective exhale. Daniel stood still, processing what he had heard. Relief washed over him slowly, as if he didn't quite trust it yet. His shoulders relaxed for the first time since he had stepped forward. Judge Caprio added that the dismissal came with an expectation, not a warning. An expectation that Daniel would continue doing what he had already been doing, taking care of his family, living with integrity, teaching his children what responsibility looked like through action, not words. Daniel nodded. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. He thanked the judge, not dramatically, not emotionally, just sincerely. Judge Caprio responded in the same way. He thanked Daniel for his service, for his honesty, for reminding everyone in the room that strength didn't always announce itself loudly. As Daniel turned to leave, people in the gallery watched him differently than when he had walked in. He wasn't just another name on the docket anymore. He was a man who had been seen. He paused briefly near the aisle, steadying himself, then continued forward. Judge Caprio called the next case, resuming the courtroom's routine. But something lingered in the air, a reminder that justice could be firm without being cold, that authority could be exercised without losing compassion. Daniel stepped out of the courtroom with lighter steps than he had entered with. The problem that brought him there was resolved, but something more important had happened. He left with his dignity intact. And for a man who had spent much of his life giving without asking, that recognition mattered more than $50 ever could. The courtroom moved on to the next case, just like it always did. Names were called. Papers were shuffled. Life continued. But for the people who witnessed what happened that day, something stayed behind. It wasn't about a parking ticket anymore. It was about what happens when authority meets humanity, when a person in power chooses to see the person, not just the problem. Daniel walked back into the world carrying the same responsibilities he had before. Bills still waited. Work still demanded his time. Life didn't suddenly become easier, but he carried something new with him. He carried the quiet knowledge that his effort had been seen, not celebrated loudly, not turned into a spectacle, simply acknowledged with respect. Judge Caprio didn't change Daniel's past. He didn't erase struggle. He did something far more meaningful. He reminded everyone in that room that justice isn't just about enforcing rules. It's about recognizing character. Moments like this are why these courtrooms matter, why these stories matter, because they show us that compassion doesn't weaken the law. It strengthens it. Somewhere down the line, Daniel's children will hear about this day, not as a story about getting out a ticket, but as a lesson about how integrity is noticed even when no one is watching. If this story moved you, take a moment to acknowledge it. Like the video, share it with someone who believes kindness still has a place in the world. And if you want more real stories where justice is balanced with empathy, where humanity leads the way, consider subscribing to the channel. The next story waiting to be told might remind you of something important too, that even in the most ordinary places, quiet moments of dignity can leave the deepest impact.